Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar, How to Integrate Gender in Project Development. We are going to wait a couple of minutes more, 1 or 2 minutes before we start, so remaining colleagues can join us. Speak soon. Thank you. Hello, for those of you who just joined us. We are just waiting 1 minute more, and then we will start with the webinar. Thank you. So hello again. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, How to Integrate Gender in Project Development. This webinar is a joint collaboration between the Economy Division and also the Gender and Safeguards Unit. And today, in the next hour, we will present and discuss strategies to include gender analysis in projects, and specifically how to do so in the context of UN Environment Program. We are recording this webinar, so we can share with you and with other later. And we would like to ask you to please hold questions until after the presentation, or you can also, of course, write them in the chat box throughout the presentation. My name is Fernanda. I work at the Consumption Production Unit in the Economy Division. And with me today, presenting this webinar, we also have Beatrice. She's Program Management Officer in the Consumption Production Unit. She's based in Paris. And Beatrice is also the Gender Coordinator for the Economy Division. And we also have Raymond Brands, who is Program Management Officer on Gender in the Gender and Safeguards Unit, and he's based in Nairobi. This is the outline of today's webinar. So Raymond will start us off by presenting important definitions and some relevant terms that we usually find when we talk about integrating gender in project development. And Raymond will also present basically what this topic entails within UNEP and also some available approaches to mainstream gender in the projects. After that, Beatrice will then present this topic under the SDGs and also some insights on the current impact of COVID-19 on women. After that, she will present the Gender and Environment Support Kit, which is available to everyone that works at the UN Environment Program. And at the end, we'll walk you through some short examples from how to integrate gender in projects in resource efficiency and also in climate change. And we'll, of course, give you the floor, and so that you can ask your questions. Okay, so now, Raymond, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fernanda, and welcome everybody. My name is Raymond Brandes, as Fernanda said, and I'm based in Nairobi in the Gender and Safeguards Unit. Today I walk you through a few definitions and what it means for UNEP programming, program development. Don't worry, you can have the presentation later, so we'll go through it quite quickly, not to lose too much time, so that we can spend more time on showing you the practical examples. First of all, what is gender? Just to make sure that people understand the difference between gender and sex. Gender refers to the social attributes and opportunities associated with being male and female, the relationships between women and men, girls and boys, and the relationships between women and those between men. In most societies, there are differences in inequalities between women and men in responsibilities, activities, access to control over resources, and decision-making opportunities. And all these things are built by society, so they can also be changed. That's where our angle is to make a change. That's different from sex, that are biological characteristics of the differences between men and women. Next slide, please.
Raymond, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. If we skip one.
Okay. Is it this one?
No, you were going too far, sorry. Yes.
Okay, so it's this one, right?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, when we talk about integrating gender in programming and policy development, we're talking about mainstreaming gender, which is a strategy for making the concerns and experiences of women as well as men an integral part of the design, implementation, and many of policies and programs in all different spheres where women and men play a role, and where women and men should benefit equally, and inequality should not be perpetuated. The ultimate goal of this mainstreaming is to achieve gender equality. Now, sometimes we need to work with give affirmative action to one or the other, to make sure that the inequality that has grown over time is going to be balanced out, so that we can achieve gender equality. This approach is chosen by the United Nations and the international community as the approach to go to since the Beijing conference in 1995. Next slide, please. So what we do in preparation of program development is applying a gender analysis while you're doing your general context analysis. We're just making context analysis really relevant for gender. And in this assessment, we look at how and why gender differences and inequalities are relevant for the specific environmental projects that we're developing. It's a first step in the gender mainstreaming strategy. It includes collecting and using sex disaggregated data on women, men, girls, and boys in terms of their roles and responsibility in their environment, and especially in relation to the environment project that you envision. You can have relation to provisions of labor, access to resources, and the socioeconomic status, the poverty status that vary. Gender mainstreaming cannot occur without having a proper gender analysis in place, because that is the basis for developing your activities. Next slide, please. So what is then sex disaggregated data? It refers to the data that we collect broken down by sex. Mostly that is being used between male and female, but sometimes age has also been integrated so that also boys and girls are being segregated. This allows for measurements of differences between those categories on various dimensions that are applicable for the project that we are using. Next slide, please. So how do we do now that gender analysis and come to a gender action plan? Well, related to gender analysis, it's simply a few questions that we need to address. Who does what? Because often there's a labor division between men and women. Who does what? When are they doing it? Because timing is very important for the activities that you're developing. Women and men can have different calendars throughout the day. So you have to take that into consideration when you plan to work with them. Where does something take place? Men and women can work in different places, so you have to be careful about that. Who has what? Because ownership is very important, and especially in environment and agriculture, land is a very important resource, and ownership of that also tells you who can control it. That relates also to the next question: who decides and how is being decided? And because of patriarchal societies where male preferences, those are usually the one in deciding position. So how do we change that context? Who gains and who will lose from the current status, but also when you're going to do an activity, you want to see what you effectively want to achieve, but also to see the things that you might encounter while you're doing it unintendedly. How do we gather this information? Well, we can do that directly with the beneficiaries or the target groups that we're working with, to interview them or to give them questionnaires and surveys to collect primary data. Or we can read literature, reports, and check statistics and data that are already available. What is important for gender action, gender results, is that when you develop the activities, that you look at equal participation or representation of men and women, that you consider the gender needs that occur between men and women. I'll explain those terminologies, practical and strategic needs, the next slide. So be patient with me. You then also want to make sure that your approaches and results are gender responsive. And then when you're developing your results, you want to look at it from a gender disaggregated point of view, or that the indicators are gender related. The targets can be quantitative. It can be a number of men and women participating in the training, but it could also be a qualitative one when you have a general environmental policy, but you state that you want to make sure that those are gender responsive. Lastly, what is often forgotten is to make sure that there's separate budget for these gender activities. So we are promoting gender budgeting. Next slide, please. So coming back to these few terminologies that I just used, the practical needs and accommodative approaches or results. Women practical needs are very different from those of men, and that comes from the reproductive roles that they have. And because they have different roles, there's an approach called gender accommodating approach, which recognizes this, that there are certain practical needs that they have, that you can refer to that and address those without challenging the power relation or the subordinate position of women compared to men. And since you often then work with only women, it's referred to as women's empowerment. Now, in women's empowerment, we should not forget to work with men as well, or to at least inform them of what we are doing with women. Otherwise, you may end up making, for instance, violence against women a bigger problem. Next slide, please. So what are then the strategic needs, the transformative approaches and results related to that? Strategic needs arise from this difference of power relation when women have subordinate positions, because they have different positions in society, especially in strong patriarchal societies. The inequality between men and women can be quite large. The approaches that then are necessary are referred to as transformative, gender transformative approaches, because they challenge the nature of this gender power relation between men and women and lead to a transformation of gender division of labor. This could be through examples of access to resources, land, and credits, so that the balance between who owns something and who can decide something is changed. At the same time, this has to do very much with existing gender norms and relations that need to be changed. And as I said in the beginning, a gender is a concept that has been established by societal interactions. So we could also change that towards more equitable relationships between men and women and creating a more socially enabling environment. So in the previous slide, you could think of a practical need when women used to collect water, that the collection points go closer to their homes so that it takes less time for women to collect water. But in the strategic needs of transformative approach, you could think about that men also collect water so that women can spend their time also on productive activities. Next slide, please. So what does it entail within UNEP? So we're doing program and policy development. And in the processes within UNEP, we have two processes that are happening when programs are getting developed. Next slide, please. The first process is about reviewing concepts. When they are submitted to the concept review committee, we as the gender and social, the safeguard unit are also involved looking at the concept notes from a gender perspective. And we have a very free format of presenting back to the proponents, so that while they are developing the full proposal, they can take our comments into consideration. And along that journey, we can together develop the gender-related components of the project. Then when the full proposal has been developed, it's being submitted to the project review committee, where we will conduct a full gender assessment of the project document, the so-called gender marker format. In that, we are looking at how gender has been mainstreamed, the context part, the implementation part, the results part, and the budget part. Now, this all leads to a gender analysis and a gender action plan. And we're very happy that many of you already do that. But what we would propose also is to make sure that the context analysis from a gender perspective, as well as the activities that are being developed through the gender action plan, are being mainstreamed in the overall parts of the project document, so that it's really an integrated part of the project document. Next slide, please. That's where I hand over to Beatrice.
Thank you, Raymond. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Raymond, for your presentation and for introducing the topic. I think that you covered most of the essential aspects of our conversation here today. I would just like to add to the point of what this entail in UNEP, also the part of the publications, that we try to make sure that all publications that we issue at UNEP, they do have an eye, like an approach towards gender, that this doesn't go unperceived in the publication. So we, as gender coordinators and gender focal points, we revise all publications that that we are issuing in a period, to make sure that we try as much as possible to integrate gender aspects into our publications. And all this work we do in contributing to the achievement, of course, of the new Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals, not only to SDG 5, which goes about gender equality, but also to a number of targets that are spread across all of the 17 goals of the SDGs. For example, in Goal 12, we have a target that explicitly mentions the creation of full employment to both women and men equally. So it's gender is actually mainstream within many of the 17 SDGs, and it's not only kept under SDG 5. Next slide, please. As in this current situation, I could not refrain from mentioning the current situation and the challenges brought by COVID-19, which are disproportionately affecting girls and women around the globe. So there will be aggravated impacts of COVID-19 for women already living on the economic margins, and also violence against women and girls, and particularly domestic violence, has intensified. This, we already have data showing that the cases of domestic violence increased in many countries, including in France. So we have in France a report of domestic violence has increased 13% since the last data in March 17th of March 2020. Also in Cyprus and Singapore, we have registered an increase in calls of 30% and 33% respectively. In Argentina, emergency calls for domestic violence cases have increased 25% since the lockdown. So, and just to mention a few. And also in terms of the work burden, we know that women spend 3 times as many hours as men in unpaid care and domestic work, limiting their access to decent work. And this was even increased during the pandemic and the confinement. The next slide, please. But not only that, not only the case of domestic violence, but also the exposure and the risk of exposure to COVID-19 due to the presence of women in the workforce related to the healthcare sector. It's also worth mentioning in this case. So these are some of the key points that UNEP included in their response to COVID-19 and the gender impacts. So the relationship between nature, poverty, and human health has contributed to the spread of COVID-19, and this has shaped power relations at household level, including leading to domestic violence, as shown. Due to lower economic activity, women tend to lose jobs more, especially when it comes to the informal sector, which is largely occupied by women. And the exposure to medical waste, as the majority of informal waste collectors are women. Those are also some of the unbalanced consequences of this pandemic to women. The next slide, please. So these UNEP came up with some examples of responses from these challenges. So protecting female environmental defenders during and after the crisis, continue collecting sex disaggregated data and inclusion of gender analytical data to support the delivery of policy responses. So when we are revising your projects now to address sometimes the delays or the change in activities that will be due to the confinement and the COVID, please take into consideration including a gender dimension to it. Also, integrate gender equality perspectives into work on climate change, climate and security, chemicals and waste management, for example. Develop gender responsive methodologies, tools and policies for a better understanding of the human and environment health and waste linkages. Enhancing proactive and sound conservation practices, ecosystem management, ecosystem restoration, and sustainable use of natural resources and biodiversity, and to support the work of the secretariats and UNEP administered multilateral environmental agreements. So those are some of the responses that UNEP included in the paper we launched a couple of weeks ago about the COVID responses. Next slide, please. But the main focus of these of my presentation today would be to talk to you about the UNEP Gender Environment Support Kit that was produced and launched in 2018, and which aims to help colleagues understand the relevance of gender in their respective work streams and to provide clear entry points to include the gender dimension in project and program management. The next slide, please. So, as Raymond already said, we have different stages or different entry points where we can bring the gender dimension. So first, in the context situation analysis, so to describe the roles, as mentioned, as Raymond said, so who does what, and so this is very important when you are describing the context in which your project should be applied to or should operate to, and take into consideration the different gender roles. To analyze the gender gap in the project situation, but also in the, for example, when you are analyzing policies, the gender gap in the policy that is related to your work stream in the concrete case. To address the availability of sex disaggregated data at country level, but also in a more specific context. So, for example, sometimes you need sex disaggregated data at local level in a specific city, or maybe at community level. So this all can be taken into consideration in the situation analysis. If you have specific policies addressing a gender, and also when you're doing the stakeholder analysis, to take into consideration the distribution of the stakeholders who we are working with, and how how the gender roles and will play differently depending on the stakeholder groups that you are including. And then the next box, please. The second entry point would be the sorry about that, I just missed here. The designing activities and outcomes. So when you're doing a gender action plan, so you have to describe and take into consideration how you will engage women in your project. If you're going to have different strategies to engage women, if there is need, or maybe sometimes we don't need to have different strategies to engage women stakeholders, but then to take this into consideration when doing your action plan. To consider also the team composition. So who will be part of your team? If you're hiring consultants, who you're hiring? If you're hiring, if you're having SSFAs with external partners. So who will be working in those projects? Also take a gender dimension into consideration in the team composition. Is the gender perspective included? So this we already talked. When you're designing activities, so maybe you have to have activities that take place, I don't know, in the evening, so that women can leave home and go, or in some context you cannot have meetings in the evening because then women are not as free to go out in the evening. So you have to actually adapt your activities to be sure that you are able to engage women in your project activities. Also, to include gender knowledge. Here we are talking not only about data and also specific policies, but also that you take into consideration gender responsive language and gender when you're doing your activities. And also be inclusive in your communication. You have to make sure that you use gender neutral and also gender responsive language when you are communicating about your project in your gender action plan. The next slide, please. And lastly, and somehow sometimes more importantly, remember to include, when you have activities, remember when planning of gender-related activities, remember to include them in the budget. If gender activities are not covered in the budget, they risk being excluded in project implementation. So if you say that you will collect sex disaggregated data, make sure that you put an amount there that is to cover this collection of data. If you are saying that you will have a component that will take into consideration gender when assessing national policies to see if there is a gap in gender, so make sure that you have a line that says that assessment of gender gaps in policy in national policies. So make sure that you disaggregate your budget as much as possible to be able to cover these activities. And also hire a gender expert to support analysis, assessment, and workshops. So make sure that when you hire, for example, when you hire a consultant to do a report, that you include there that she or him they have to have knowledge on gender, and they have to take gender into consideration when drafting your report. And also allocate specific budget to gender sensitive communications outreach. Also, this is key to make sure that you will be able to implement those activities at the end. Next slide, please. And here is where I hand over to Fernanda, who is going to bring some concrete, more concrete examples on how to integrate gender in project development. Again, this all comes from the Gender Environment Support Kit, which is available at We Collaborate, I believe, and I think in our website, but definitely in We Collaborate. So Fernanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. And yes, as Beatrice just mentioned, the idea here is that we could make it even more practical for you. So we want to share some examples on how to do that. I mean, how to incorporate gender for specific content areas. In the part 2 of the kit, as you can see in this image here, you can find information on each of the 7 priority areas of UNEP. Each of the sessions in the document actually discusses why gender is relevant, some important entry points, and also examples of relevant projects in each of these areas. But in the interest of time, we are going to present 2 of them today only, so climate change and resource efficiency. And I'm going to start with resource efficiency. So we all actually know that gender is a critical component that we have to consider when we are formulating projects related to resource efficiency. So for instance, when promoting sustainable consumption production, which is included in this priority area, we have to consider, for example, the different needs of women and men as consumers. And then to provide the context analysis of the project, here in this slide, you can see some entry points that we could all take. So for instance, we could analyze the role of women and men in the green economy, including gender labor markets, and also we could consider barriers and opportunities for women and men. We could also have a better understanding of the consumption behaviors of men and women, including the influence that women and men have in the family context. And of course, this depends on the cultural context, as also Beatrice mentioned before. And we could also develop this understanding through gender-specific surveys and data available. For the planning and implementation phase of projects, here are some examples. So we can, for instance, raise stakeholders' awareness of the gender and social impacts of, general policies on resource efficiency. We can also promote women's participation in policy development and also decision-making processes for resources management. Again, support social protection laws for women and also guarantees, depending on the country we are working on, depending on the country where the project is implemented. And also ensuring equal opportunities for women and men to participate in the green economy. So these are potential examples of how this could be incorporated in planning and implementation of projects. We should also include specific gender components in the outcomes, in outputs and activities of our project proposal. So for instance, here, in terms of activities, we can conduct gender analysis, include gender perspectives in trainings, consult groups of men and women, and also include perspectives of men and women in communications and also in all types of outreach efforts. In terms of outputs, increase the knowledge of the gender impacts of projects among consumers and stakeholders is one of the possibilities. And also one example of outcomes would be that resource efficiency projects are then gender responsive. These are two examples from projects on resource efficiency, which successfully incorporated gender aspects. So here we can see the first one, which is delivering the transition to energy efficient lighting in Pakistan. So essentially, the project document includes the terms of reference for the proposed national gender mainstreaming specialist. And the duties and responsibilities of these specialists would be essentially to mainstream gender concerns or gender aspects in all phases of the project life cycle. And it acknowledges actually that without a gender consultant in this type of project, the project could actually risk reinforcing or even exacerbating existing inequalities in the country. So that's why in this case, it was very important to bring these specialists. And also another example comes from UN Environment Finance Initiative, the UNEP FI. So in 2017, they launched a strategy on social issues for 2017 until 2020. And actually they included the financial inclusion and more specifically gender inclusion as part of a wider field of enhancing access to finance. So they did mention the gender inclusion explicitly in this strategy. So now moving on to climate change. As we know, again, women and men are very much likely to be affected in different ways by the impacts of climate change. And this is due to gender inequalities and of course, how this relates to, a general economic, political or social opportunities. And these again are just examples on how to provide the context analysis in project proposals. So for instance, we can analyze general gender gaps and power relations. So for example, access to land, access to education, or how formal labor markets in the countries or in the localities where the project is implemented, how these take place. And we could ask, of course, whether there are any national climate change related policies that are gender sensitive, and how gender equality policies include climate change considerations, or whether they include climate change considerations. So here, for example, we can have a look at the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, or the National Adaptation Program of Actions, the NAPAs, and also the NAMAs. So we can have a look at these documents within the countries that we are working on to see whether gender is mentioned or not. And finally, gender gaps in climate change related areas. So for instance, energy access, access to various natural resources or ecosystem services in general, and also, for example, environmental political participation, whether women have access to these type of stakeholder engagement in the country. So these are essentially entry points that we could work on this topic of climate change and trying to mainstream gender. Here for planning and implementation, we can consider specific gender components in the outcomes, in outputs and activities. So here, just listing some examples. I'll not go through all of them because we will have access to all this presentation, but just giving examples in terms of how to include specific gender components in activities. We can conduct gender assessments, trainings that include gender perspectives of climate change, and also consultations with both women and men. In terms of outputs, some examples of sentences. For example, livelihood improvement plans based on urban ecosystems and gender roles developed and implemented within poor urban communities. And also specific gender components in outcomes. So there are some indicators that we could use to track that. So for instance, the percentage increase in women's access to energy and renewable energy asset ownership, or the number of women who received skills development training in energy entrepreneurship. So here, 2 examples again on how these is being done successfully by other projects. So the first one, the Gender Sensitive National Adaptation Plan. So essentially, they organized a workshop in Colombo in Sri Lanka for the National Adaptation Plan's Global Support Program. And then UN Environment Asia Pacific included gender perspectives in the overall presentations and also in the group discussions. And actually what happened was that the participants expressed a strong interest in these issues, and even the member states requested to further support to increase institutional capacities for gender in the adaptation planning. And the second example is related to the Women's Entrepreneurship for Sustainable Energy Program, which is a joint program by UN Environment Program and UN Women. And the objective of this project is essentially to increase women's access to sustainable energy and also empower these women to be agents of change in the field of sustainable energy in some countries, both in Africa and also in Asia. So finally, this is the last slide. These are resources available on the topic. In addition to the documents which we based our presentation on, which are essentially the first 2 documents here, we also included further guidance on this topic that are provided by the GEF and also the Green Climate Fund, because we thought this could be of your interest when you are presenting, project proposals. And I think that's all from our side now. And of course, we are happy to hear from you. If you have any questions you want to, and if you prefer to include on the chat box, please feel free to do so. Thank you. Okay, let me just check. Apparently we have some questions here. Okay, so Eloise just asked, what is the difference between described roles and stakeholder analysis? Would you, Beatrice or Raymond, would like to offer an answer to Eloise in that question? She's asking about the difference between describing roles and also conducting a stakeholder analysis.
I think that the way it is in the presentation, it might create a bit of confusion because stakeholder analysis is one section of the project document template. So this is when you are addressing this, this part of the template, then you should include the gender perspective there. And I think that describing the roles is when you're doing the analysis. But of course that you can describe the role when you are doing the stakeholder analysis in both places. I think it's just the way because the presentation has two parts. One that is more based on the toolkit itself, which is the second part, and the first part is the general concepts and all these things that Raymond presented. So I think that it's phrased as stakeholder analysis because it's following the rationale in the project document template.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Beatrice. And I'm now going to read the comment and the question put forward by Denise San Valentin. So she says, UNEP project documents are more like umbrella projects, and I feel like there's a gap between the gender analysis happening at that level to the actual implementation of projects, so SSFAs and PCAs. So the question is, has there been any discussion within UNEP on developing specific policies, for example, mainstreaming gender in due diligence processes and procurement by adding gender-sensitive criteria for selection of vendors or implementing partners, and mainstreaming gender in final reporting by implementing partners, etc.? Would any Beatrice or Raymond add to that, whether there are discussions within UNEP on developing specific policies? And she mentions examples, for example, the due diligence processes and procurement.
Yeah, well, yeah, go ahead, Raymond, please.
I think we have to distinguish two separate ways of looking at this. One is that from UNEP's headquarter, from our unit, we have a specific gender policy and strategy that is currently being updated. But also we have general policies which have gender perspectives, like how do you recruit somebody, how do you procurement. Those have elements of how to integrate gender in those perspectives. And I would like to believe that we have integrated that in all of these policies.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Raymond.
Beatrice, anything to add to that?
No, I was just going to mention exactly that we have a policy that is being now revised, as you mentioned, but also we had a pledge made by our former executive director on gender equality. That is, and we were collecting data, but this was also until 2019. So a new pledge should be, I don't know, discussed or made soon. Yeah, we are now in between policies and pledges.
Okay, great, thank you. So Sudhi Sharma also included a comment sharing a challenge. So he says, there are two challenges. One, countries don't have analysis on gender, and mostly GEF projects have limited resources to develop projects. So any detailed analysis is difficult. And then the question is how to address that. And also, second, in GEF projects are country-owned projects. A lot of the activities have to be agreed by the country stakeholders. And these in many countries not easy. So how does one address these? So this is really specifically to how we can relate to GEF project proposals. either Raymond or Beatrice would have experience and what would want to share on that.
I can start. Yes, not every country has gender statistics readily available. One of the options is to look at neighboring countries or regional data that is available, which could be extrapolated to the countries that you work in. The other alternative is if there's not resources available before starting a project, is to include gender assessment at the start of a program, so that you build it into the project budget. The other question was related to national ownership. As many activities that we're involved in, and that goes for gender as well, implementation and getting agreement with governments or other partners is not always easy, but it doesn't mean we should not do it. And I think from the perspective of the UNEP, who's very much a gender champion, it is almost mandatory for us to make sure that we integrate gender and that we make our partners understand the importance of it, and that we really give it a try to convince our partners to continue gender mainstreaming. Also, what might be helpful is to relate to the fact that many countries have signed up for gender policy strategies, conventions, etc. So while maybe your direct partners may not be so open to discuss it, at the highest level of those countries, they made pledges that they will do gender mainstream. So we just have to make sure that we hold them to account doing so. Beatrice, anything to add to that?
Not much. Just to highlight that sometimes even if there is not much agreement, it's important that we would be the ones bringing the subject to the table, you know, and of course presenting some ideas or some suggestions on how to incorporate and how to move forward with this dimension.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Raymond and Beatrice. And just a remark, actually, still from Sadhu, that actually the Pakistan Lightning project that I presented, he mentioned that this is a project, this is a JEF and CCM project. So thank you very much for making this remark, Sadhu. So we have some other questions here. I'm just trying to pick up some, and then of course, if we don't have time to deal with all the questions now during this webinar, we can of course make sure we reach out to any of you with for the responses or guidance. Okay, so we have a question from Osman Tariq. There's a lot of focus on having the gender issues or perspectives in the project development phase. What about during and after the project is conducted? How do we continue to engage the partners in thinking about gender issues throughout and after the project is done? And are there any consequences of countries which do not follow our guidance? Thank you for the question, Osman. So it's basically a question about the implementation and the final phase of the project after this is conducted.
Let me start again.
Thank you, Raymond.
Well, I think what has come out of our presentation is that it's important to make sure that you have very specific activities and outputs developed, as well as assign the proper human and financial resources to it, so that they actually can happen during the implementation of a program. What we often see is that because of not assigning budget specifically to those activities, is that they are then not happening, or when indicators have not been gender sensitive enough, so that if it says a policy needs to be developed, it can be ticked, but if it was said specifically that it has to be gender responsive, you have to meet that criteria too before you can tick that box. So it's very important to be very detailed in what you want to achieve, and that you assign budget and human resources to carry it out. Now, after the project, that is more difficult, of course. But by mainstreaming gender and by taking our partners at the hand to go through it, we are also hopeful that while they're experiencing how important and how beneficial integration of gender is in the projects, that they will continue doing so after the project. Beatrice?
Okay. Great, Raymond.
Just want to add that when we are doing the evaluation of the projects after they conclude, we are more and more taking into consideration if gender aspects were considered and how they were considered and implemented. So this is also something that you should pay attention when designing and implementing your project, that this is being more and more taken into consideration at the evaluation phase. And also becoming more and more important for some donors. Some donors are specifically now requesting activities and outputs related to gender. So, for example, International Climate Initiative, also the European Commission, they are more and more asking for this dimension to be included in projects that are funded by them.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Raymond and Beatrice again. I think we may have time for one more question. So let's see how we go about that. I will just pick one here. So, okay, so from Tanya Dakaret, she asks, if the project doesn't have enough budget for project gender specialists for the full period of the project, what would you recommend? Option A, have a gender consultant participating in very specific activities, or having other team members, communications lead, project manager, for example, being responsible for gender activities, even if they are not gender experts. Thank you for the question, Tanya. Raymond.
Well, first of all, when you assign gender responsibilities to people that have no affiliation or background in it, you need to train them. So that is going to be a cost as well, which would not be beneficial to the project. So hiring a gender consultant would, in my case, would be preferred, but it really depends on the project that you have, because maybe you want to mainstream it in so many components that you do have to train your colleagues in all different facets of integrating gender. Also for long-term gender mainstreaming, it would be good to actually train the people that would be responsible for other topics so that they're trained in gender. But that has a long-term implication and also a cost implication.
Okay, great. Thank you, Raymond. Well, let me just check if we have other specific questions here. Okay. Yeah, Milena includes a reflection, but I'll just share the reflection. I don't know if we'll be able to, provide a full answer during the webinar, but then we can just all leave with the reflection that you proposed. So to what extent do we at UNEP work on identifying and consulting with women, gender groups, associations, or stakeholders on project formulation? Also, what are the main constraints to maybe doing it more? Do you want to provide a response to that reflection, Raymond or Beatrice? And then I think we have to finish after that because we are almost in our limit time. And of
Sure.
course, for the others, we'll of course make sure we read and take into consideration all your questions. If you still have questions, you can even include that now in the chat box, and we'll deal with the questions and get back to you by email afterwards. Thank you, Raymond. Go ahead, please.
Yes, no, I'm very happy that this is brought up, because that's exactly in a lot of program reviews that we're doing, is that we're promoting, making sure that these stakeholders, women groups, women associations, other kinds of representation for women are being included in the context analysis. But not only in that part, women are also often perceived as being the victims or the recipients of aid, and while they are very much the ones who can help us actually achieve the results that we need. So we should also involve them as the active participants of projects, and even in leadership positions I'm advocating for. What was the second part of the question?
Sorry, I was muted. The second part was related to the main constraints and to maybe doing it more, but I think I already addressed somehow,
well,
right?
The main constraints are often in the fact that in patriarchal societies where it's men in leadership roles and men overall having a larger presence in the active participation of projects, is that it's difficult to include them sometimes. And that's why also in the contextual analysis, it's important to see when men and women differently might be available to actually be contacted or being a part of the project implementation, so that we are accommodating ourselves to their schedules. And since many projects happen during daytime and where women have reproductive and domestic tasks to perform, they're often excluded through that way. So we really have to look at the context and the calendars of both sexes, so that we can anticipate how to do our project implementation.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Raymond. Thank you very much, Beatrice, and thank you all for participating today. You have our email address in the presentation that you will receive shortly after the webinar today, and we also share with all of you the recording of this webinar. Thank you very much for your participation, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.